Hi, this is Alexandra Kitty, and this is Officer Down, a true crime podcast where the focus is on when victims are in law enforcement. Today, we're going to go to France for the final episode of this season. Next season will be a different twist, new cases, but not the same underlying theme as it was this season. So we're going to Saint-Just, France, uh, gendarmes shooting. So when heroes again fall to domestic violence, if you listened to last week in Kentucky, it was basically another instance when a domestic violence incident accumulated in the deaths of multiple police officers and a canine Drago. So on December 23rd, 2020, in the rural hamlet named near Saint-Just, France, three gendarmes were shot and killed responding to a domestic violence call, marking one of the deadliest attacks on French law enforcement outside of terrorism in recent history. Frédérik Limol, a 48-year-old heavily armed survivalist with apocalyptic religious beliefs, ambushed responding officers who came to rescue his partner from the rooftop where she had fled to escape his violence. The incident, described by local prosecutors as resembling a war zone, resulted in the deaths of Brigadier Arno Mavel, 21, Lieutenant Cyrille Morel, 45, and Adjudant Rémi Dupuis, 47, with a fourth officer wounded. Limol later committed suicide after a brief manhunt. So this should sound actually familiar from last week. So if nothing, these people are very predictable. The tragedy highlighted France's escalating domestic violence crisis and the extreme dangers faced by gendarmes in rural areas. So let's talk about the victims. Brigadier Arno Mavel was 20 years old. The youngest of the three fallen officers, Mavel was killed instantly when Limol opened fire without warning as the first responders arrived at the scene shortly after midnight. He was shot first, becoming the initial casualty of the ambush. At just 21 years old, Mavel represented the new generation of French law enforcement dedicated to protecting rural communities. On December 20, 2020, he was posthumously awarded the Legion of Honor, Chevalier, during a ceremony attended by the Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin and Armed Forces Minister Florence Parly. Then there was Lieutenant Cyrille Morel. He was age 45. So Lieutenant Morel was killed as he approached the residence with reinforcements after the initial shooting. He left behind a widow and children, part of the four total children orphaned by the attack. Morel served with the National Gendarmerie Amber Brigade, responsible for policing the rural communes of the region. His death represented the loss of an experienced officer who had dedicated decades to public service. He was posthumously elevated to Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. Then there was Adjudant Rémi Dupuis. He was age 37. So he was killed alongside Lieutenant Morel as they responded to aid their fellow officers. He also left behind a widow and children. Dupuis represented the backbone of France's rural law enforcement, experienced, dedicated gendarmes who served in the National Gendarmerie, which is responsible for smaller towns and rural areas where police forces are not present. So he was also awarded the Legion of Honor posthumously. There was a fourth officer whose name was never publicly released. He was shot in the thigh during the initial ambush, but he survived his injuries. His condition was reported as not life-threatening. So the collective family impact was the three fallen officers left behind, three widows, and a total of 4 children. So let's talk about Saint-Just, its location. It's a tiny commune in central France. As of 2022, population was just 147 residents, down from 160 in 2015 and 172 in 2010. The shooting occurred in an isolated hamlet near the village, approximately 50 miles southwest of Clermont-Ferrand and about 115 miles west of Lyon. The remote rural setting contributed to the danger faced by the responding officers as the location was dark, isolated, and difficult to secure. It's a little bit about the demographics. Jew is a part of the Amber region, which has a population of 26,485, spread across 55 communes as of the Gironde jurisdiction data. The area is characterized by aging demographics typical of rural France, with the median ages well above urban centers. A little bit about Amber, the nearest town, and the police base. So the fallen officers were assigned to the National Gendarmerie Brigade in Amber, the sub-prefecture of the region located near Saint-Just. Amber had a 2022 population of 6,556, declining from 6,743 in 2015. The town has a median age of 51 years and a median income of almost 22,000 euros. So in this region, there's about 3,115 males, which makes up 47.1% of that population. 3,501, which makes almost 53% of the population. Population that is over the age of 65 is almost 2,000, which is almost 30%. And French citizens, it makes up 96.1%. So the crime statistics, the Amber Gendarmerie zone, covering 55 communes, with 26,485 residents, recorded remarkably low crime rates compared to the national French average. Total crimes and offenses, the local rate is per 100,000 people, it was 2,869. The national rate on the other hand, is 5,258. So it was 45% below the national average. Burglaries, 366 versus the national average of 518, 29% below the national average. Vehicle theft, 218 versus 707 with the national average, which is 69% below the national average. And theft from individuals, 385 for this town, versus the national average of 1,019, which is 62% below the national average. Physical violence, 347 per 100,000 versus 655, which was 47% below the national average. Sexual violence, 86 versus 76 for the national. So here it's 13% above the national average. So we can check this off as safe, except for sexual violence. So the region's crime profile reflects typical rural patterns, lower overall crime, but persistent issues with domestic and sexual violence. So the Puy-de-Dôme department had a 2022 population of 664,385, with the prefecture in Clermont-Ferrand. The department is part of another region which is in central France. So let's talk about the perpetrator, Frédérik Limol. So he was born in October 1972 and died December 23, 2020. He was 48 years old at the time of the shooting. Prosecutor Eric Melot described him as having a very concerning profile, a heavily armed survivalist with strong Catholic religious beliefs that appeared to be apocalyptic in nature. He had received a brief military training and was skilled in marksmanship. A little bit about his background and history. Limol was known to authorities for child custody disputes with his ex-wife, with whom he had a contentious divorce proceedings. However, there was no prior records of domestic violence or threats against Sandrine S., his current partner, who was hospitalized and unable to be interviewed immediately following the incident. He was described as an amateur shooter who was heavily armed. When his body was discovered, investigators found a Glock pistol, one in his hand, an AR-15-style semi-automatic rifle equipped with suppressor, flashlight, and laser sight, 4 knives attached to his belt. He wore a bulletproof vest and numerous cartridge casings at the crime scene indicating sustained gunfire. The prosecutor noted that Limol was exceedingly determined to inflict harm regardless of who was present. So let's talk about the timeline of the attack and the ambush. The incident began when a friend of Sandrine S., Limol's partner, called police late on December 22, 2020, reporting that Limol was holding the woman against her will and threatening her. Sandrine herself had called to say she was being threatened. At some point, she managed to escape the roof of the house to stay safe while the structure caught fire. When the first two gendarmes arrived shortly after midnight on December 23rd, 2020, Limol opened fire without warning. One officer, 21-year-old Brigadier Arno Mavel, was killed instantly. The second officer was shot in the thigh before Limol set the house ablaze. So, needless to say, there was an escalation. Police reinforcements, firefighters, and a GIGN elite tactical unit were rushed to the scene. All roads leading to the isolated hamlet were blocked off. As Lieutenant Cyrille Morel and Adjudant Rémi Dupuis approached the residence with additional forces, Limol fired on them as well, killing both officers. Gendarmerie spokesperson Amadi Shura described the intervention as difficult. It was night in a rural area where it was very dark, and the suspect accused of domestic violence was firing at the police. His wife was on the roof of the house, which had caught fire, and everything happened very fast. Prosecutor Frédérik Limol called it an incredibly complex crime scene resembling a war zone. The chaotic scene included flames from the burning house, which complicated efforts by the elite GIGN unit equipped with night vision technology. Approximately 300 officers, helicopters, and police dogs were deployed in the manhunt for Limol, who was described as armed and dangerous. Around 8:45 a.m. on December 23rd, 2020, Interior Minister Gérard Darmanin announced that Limol had been discovered dead. He had fled in a vehicle but lost control about a mile from the scene, crashing into a tree. Officers found his body outside the car with a Glock pistol in one hand and the AR-15 style rifle nearby. An autopsy confirmed that Limol, who was also wearing a bulletproof vest, had 4 knives on his belt, had taken his own life. Sandrines, the domestic violence victim, was rescued safely from the burning building and hospitalized. Her child was also rescued. So let's talk a little bit about France's domestic violence crisis. The Saint-Just shooting occurred against the backdrop of France's severe and worsening domestic violence epidemic, which has been exacerbated by COVID-19 lockdowns earlier in 2020. So let's talk a little bit about the national statistics from 2019 to 2022. 2019, 150 women were killed by partners or former partners. That was a 21% increase from 2018. By 2020, 159,400 total domestic violence victims reported to police. That was a 10% increase from 2019. The 2020 COVID lockdowns, which are important to note here, reports of domestic violence jumped 30% nationally during March to April lockdowns. In Paris alone, cases were up 36%. In 2021, 321,000 women reported physical, sexual, or psychological violence by a spouse or ex-spouse. In 2021, women comprised 85% of intimate partner violence victims and 78% of domestic violence victims recorded by police. By 2022, 118 women were killed by intimate partners, femicide, representing 81% of all intimate partner homicides. 2/3 of domestic violence cases in France involve physical violence, with women representing 86% of victims and men 87% of accused perpetrators. Every year, an estimated 219,000 French women aged 18 to 75 face physical or sexual violence by current or former partners, but only 20% reported. President Emmanuel Macron has made addressing domestic violence at least seemingly a priority, and awareness has increased markedly in the years preceding the Saint-Just shooting. In 2020, France passed legislation relaxing medical confidentiality restrictions in case of immediate danger from violence, allowing practitioners to alert authorities without patient consent. The law also enhanced prison sentences for those convicted of harassing partners and criminalized unauthorized geolocation of a partner. So, no using stalking technology. France's Minister for Citizenship, Marlène Schiappa, commented after the shooting that the incident underscored the societal threat posed by domestic violence perpetrators. These individuals believe they have ownership over their partner. They will resort to any means, including violence, to maintain that control. But notice that we had to have 3 police officers killed before this was actually addressed. So let's talk a little bit about the aftermath and the national response. President Macron posted on Twitter they were intervening to rescue a woman who was the victim of domestic violence. In Puy-de-Dôme, 3 gendarmes were killed, a 4th wounded. The nation joins in the pain of families. To protect us, our forces act at the risk of their lives. They're our heroes. Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin called the circumstances of their deaths particularly despicable, following a courageous and heroic intervention. We owe them our respect and gratitude. He noted that this incident ranked among the deadliest in that country's police force's history. French Prime Minister Jean Castex expressed that this tragedy impacts us all and saddens the entire nation. On December 27, 2020, President Macron and Interior Minister Darmanin attended a ceremony honoring the fallen gendarmes. On December 28, 2020, all 3 fallen officers, Mavel, Morel, and Dupuis, were posthumously awarded the Legion of Honor, Chevalier, during a ceremony presided over by Interior Minister Darmanin and Armed Forces Minister Park. The Saint-Just shooting stands as one of the deadliest attacks on French law enforcement outside of terrorism incidents in recent decades. While French police and gendarmes have faced numerous terrorist attacks in recent years, such as the March 2018 Tribes attack, where Lieutenant Colonel Arnaud Beltrame was sacrificed himself, deadly shootings targeting police outside of terrorism are relatively rare. According to France's Interior Ministry, 11 officers and gendarmes were killed in the line of duty in 2020, including the 3 officers slain at Saint-Just. In 2018, official statistics show that 25 officers and gendarmes killed in the line of duty, up from 15 in 2017, with 13 deaths directly linked to police operations. So it's a little bit about the gendarmes in France. The National Gendarmerie is one of France's 2 national law enforcement forces, alongside the National Police. The Gendarmerie is responsible for policing smaller towns, rural areas, and suburban regions where municipal police forces do not operate. Officers killed at Saint-Just were part of this force, which faces unique challenges in isolated rural areas with limited backup and difficult terrain. In 2024-2025, France reported a record 10,000 gendarmes injured in the line of duty, representing a 4% increase from 2023. So what can we take away from this? That domestic violence is a lethal threat to law enforcement. The Saint-Just shooting powerfully illustrates the extreme danger domestic violence posed to police and gendarmes. Like the Allen, Kentucky shooting in 2022, which also involved a domestic violence EPO service turned deadly ambush, the Saint-Just incident demonstrates how perpetrators of intimate partner violence can be heavily armed, tactically prepared, and willing to kill law enforcement to avoid accountability. Prosecutor Malone's description of Limon as exceedingly determined to inflict harm, regardless of who was present, mirrors the profile of other domestic violence offenders who see police intervention as an existential threat to their control over the victims. The isolated dark rural setting near Saint-Just created a tactical nightmare for responding gendarmes. The gendarmerie spokesperson, Schur, emphasized the difficulty. It was night in a rural area where it was very dark, and the suspect accused of domestic violence was firing at gendarmes. The nearest backup was miles away, roads were narrow and single lane, and the burning house created additional chaos and danger. Limon's profile as a heavily armed survivalist with apocalyptic religious beliefs reflects a growing concern about individuals who stockpile weapons, train in marksmanship, and hold extreme ideological views. His arsenal, including an AR-15 style rifle with tactical modifications, multiple firearms, body armor, and knives, indicated significant preparation and intent to engage in armed conflicts with authorities. The deaths of the 3 young gendarmes responding to protect a woman from domestic violence resonated deeply throughout France. The incident occurred just days before Christmas, adding to the tragedy. The posthumous awarding of the Legion of Honor, France's highest order of merit, underscored the nation's gratitude and recognition of their sacrifice. Interior Minister Darmanin's words captured the sentiment. The nation bows down before their courage and commitment. President Macron's description of them as our heroes reflected the public's view of law enforcement officers who risk and sometimes give their lives to protect victims of violence. The Saint-Just shooting of December 23rd, 2020 remains a sobering reminder that domestic violence calls are among the most dangerous situations law enforcement faces. The deaths of Brigadier Arno Mavel, Lieutenant Cyrille Morel, and Adjudant Rémi Dupuis, 3 gendarmes who answered a call to save a woman's life, highlight both the courage required of rural law enforcement and the deadly threat posed by heavily armed domestic violence perpetrators. Their sacrifice continues to resonate in France's ongoing efforts to combat domestic violence and protect both victims and officers who serve them. So we don't necessarily think about domestic violence and its offshoots. Because these people are so cowardly and so possessive, they're willing to take down anybody who challenges them. And that's something we have to keep in mind. This is the end of this season. Next season, we're going to look at a different aspect of fallen police officers. So until then, until next week, this is Alexandra Kitty, and I hope I gave you something to ponder. Till next time.